And so tonight's program, inspired by the exhibition Transcendent Clay, Kondo, A Century of Japanese Ceramic Art. This exhibition features works by 3 generations of the Kyoto-based Kondo ceramic dynasty, ranging from the traditional porcelain vessels to meditative sculptures cast from the artist's body and accented with a silver mist glaze. This compelling exhibition serves as a bridge between the past and the present, as well as a meditation on the future of Japanese ceramics. And with that, I just want to give some background and introduce our speakers this evening. So we have Glenn Adamson, curator and writer. Glenn is a curator and writer who works at the intersection of craft, design history, and contemporary art. He has previously been director of the Museum of Arts and Design, head of research at the V&A, and curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. Adamson's publications include Fewer Better Things, Art in the Making, The Invention of Craft, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, The Craft Reader, and Thinking Through Craft. He currently contributes regularly to Art in America. Adamson was a co-curator of Crafting America at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in 2021, Objects USA 2020 at the R & Company Gallery, Vocals, The Breakthrough Years at the Museum of Art and Design 2016, Beasley Designs of the Year 2017 at the Design Museum London, and Things of Beauty Growing, British Studio Pottery at the Yale Center of British Art, 2017. His biographical study of the artist Lenore Tawney is included in the John Michael Kohler Art Center's exhibition catalog, Mirror of the Universe. His book, Craft, An American History, was published by Bloomsbury in January 2021, and he is currently at work on A Century of Tomorrows, a new book about the history of the future. We also have joining us Meghen Jones, Associate Professor of Art History at Alfred University. At Alfred, Meghen Jones teaches courses on East Asian visual and material culture, Buddhist art, and global ceramics and design history. Her research focuses on Japanese art and the design 1868 to today, global flows of ceramic art and design, modernism, and craft theory. Recent publications include Mingei of Oxford Bibliographies in Art History, Kitoji, excuse my pronunciation, Rosa Jean in New York, 1954, and Impressions, a chapter, National Treasure Tea Bowls as Cultural Icons in Modern Japan, in The Construction and Dynamics of Cultural Icons, and the book Ceramics and Modernity in Japan, co-edited with Louise Allison Court. She's currently editing the book Path of the Tea Bowl to be published by the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum. Her lectures on Japanese ceramics and related topics have been hosted by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Crocker Art Museum, and the University of Michigan, among others. Jones's translations from Japanese to English have appeared in projects such as the Google Cultural Institute, Made in Japan. And lastly, we have James Herring, professor at the University of Miami. James is a former director of exhibition fabrication at Frost Science Museum in Miami, Florida. He has many years of experience working to develop, design, and oversee the construction of museum exhibitions in science, art, and children's museum venues. He holds a BFA in visual arts and ceramics and an MA in Asian studies, where his main research focused on the Japanese Mingei movement and its impact on American ceramics in the post-World War II era. Currently teaches ceramics at University of Miami as an adjunct professor. And I want to specifically thank James for helping me put together this panel and this program and other programming that we plan on doing here tied to the Kondo exhibition. So without further ado, I know that was a lot of words. I'm going to hand it over to Meghen and Glenn and James. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to James Herring for the invitation to tonight's event. I'd also like to thank Kondo Takahiro for his tremendous generosity when I have interviewed him. And I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous resource that is the catalog for this exhibition. I have it right by my side here. It's edited by Joe Earl and Melanie Klein. And also you should all run out and get the recently published book, Kondo Takahiro, Vessel, Body, Void, edited by Yoshimoto Fujikawa. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to look at how the themes of Kyoto, Buddhism, and modernism interweave throughout the Kondo oeuvre. Next slide, please. For the modern dynasty of the Kondo family, the ancient capital of Kyoto is home. And here we see amidst the city's concrete, one of its more than 1,500 Buddhist temples. More than a millennium ago, Buddhist monks and the imperial family set into motion cultural practices that still permeate the city. Next slide, please. Kondo ceramics, starting with the work of Kondo Yuzo, can be traced to the elite 17th century heritage of Kyoyaki, or Kyoto ceramics, by celebrated individual artists like Nonomura Ninsei, who brought contemporaneous painterly modes to his overglazed enamel surfaces. Ninsei's jars received very high accolades in his time and since in Japan, where historically there was no hierarchy relegating ceramics to a minor status. And Ninsei was one of the first ceramic artists in the world to fabricate, paint, and sign his work, an approach that many 20th century ceramists would come to emulate. On this plate, we see Kondo Yuzo's adventurousness, not only because of the sheer scale at over 4 feet wide and requiring over 400 pounds of porcelain for its execution, but also in its style of brushstrokes that seem to draw both from East Asian monochrome ink painting as well as European style oil painting. The Kondo family's images of nature are highly individualized and for viewers also resonate with deeper meanings. A plum blossom in the snow, many people know, represents strength against adversity, since it blooms early, but it also has a Buddhist interpretation as the eye of Tathagata, the Buddha, according to the man regarded as Japan's original Zen teacher, Dogen. Next slide, please. So the cobalt blue underglaze on porcelain forms the foundation of the generational style over time of the Kondo family, often on jars, as we see here. On the left, we see the impressionistic strokes of Yuzo's Harvest Moon that speak to the influence of the celebrated modern Kyoto ceramist Tomimoto Kenkichi, for whom Yuzo was an assistant for 3 years starting in 1921. Tomimoto urged him to devote himself to the study of things beyond just manipulating the clay, however. And so Yuzo, after his time working with Tomimoto, became a student of yoga, or European-style oil painting, from 1924. And on the right, we see Hiroshi's and Takahiro's bamboo and willow images that carry, among other meanings, more Buddhist messages. Bamboo, a beloved Chinese symbol of virtuous resilience, with a hollow center that can evoke the emptiness ideals of Buddhism, and willow with healing properties associated with the bodhisattva of compassion. Next slide, please. Kondo Yuzo also drew his focus on sculptural form from Tomimoto, who had looked to Korean undecorated white porcelain for inspiration during Japan's period of Korean colonization. There was also a universalist modernist appeal associated with these undecorated forms. Next, please. Kondo Yuzo, echoing Tomimoto's sentiments, in 1928 claimed that wheel-thrown forms, in particular, superseded sculpture because they, quote, endured in ensuring one's nature, realizing a more symbolic, essential beauty. And this all foreshadowed what British art historian Herbert Reed would write in 1931, that pottery is more abstract and more pure than sculpture. And on the right, we see Kondo Takahiro's large collapsed jar. It may appear shockingly new, but I think it's best to really see it as part of a long continuum that's over 70 years of avant-garde ceramics in Kyoto. And these generational images remind me of something Kondo Yuzo is said to have uttered before he died. He said that he felt he had unfinished business yet to do, and he thought he would be reborn as a potter. Next slide, please. For our Alfred Ceramic Art Museum Tea Bowl exhibition last year, we borrowed this bowl from the Horvitzes. And at first, Kondo's patented silver mist, or gin tekisai, of silver, gold, platinum, and glass, reminded me of silver dragée, decorations for Christmas cookies and the like. They were delicate, and they also seemed somehow subversive since they thwart ease of use. In Silver Mist, Kondo wanted to use earth to make water from fire, he said, a quite universalist concept, one we could tie to modernism globally. At the same time, the palette here suggests historical Kyoto wares called ko kiyomizu with their use of blue and green. Next slide, please. Silver Mist's reflectivity recalls Yayoi Kusama's 1966 intervention at the Venice Biennale, where viewers confronted their identities as art consumers. Sphere forms in Japanese pagodas represent water above earth and below fire, wind, and air at the top. Hiroshi Sugimoto, who Kondo has acknowledged an affinity with, uses a photograph of the ocean to make literal the sphere of water in a glass pagoda. Takahiro also claims a kinship with another contemporary artist famous for his reflectivity, Anish Kapoor, whose 2006 Cloudgate is like a giant piece of silver mist, we might think. And I can't resist adding here, in popular Japanese culture in 2018, at Pucho 709, sparked a trend to scrunch up and polish aluminum foil, about 52 feet of it if you want to try this at home, until it becomes a round, shiny dumpling, or hikaru dorodango, a kind of DIY silver mist, we might say. Next slide, please. The silver mist tea-bowl also conforms at the same time to historical tea-bowl encasements in wooden boxes. Here we see the box for it. It's inscribed by the artist Kinginsai Chawan, or silver mist tea-bowl, and also bears his signature and stamp. Next. Note that the signature on the bowl's base is also a nod to the family's sometsuke, or cobalt blue underglaze roots. Next. Once again, Tomimoto is a Kondo reference point here for overglazed metallic enamels, luxury materials, particularly in the 1950s, seen anew with original designs. Next. Kondo's silver mist carries on vanguard approaches to metallic overglaze by ceramists who also, we can say, followed very closely in Tomimoto's footsteps in terms of seeking, above all, an originality of expression. Here, Yanagihara Mutsuo and Matsuda Yuriko. Next. In his reduction series, Kondo depicts himself as if in Zen Buddhist meditation, offering a reaction to the devastation of the triple disasters of 2011. One is reminded here again of Tomimoto's teaching that the ceramic vessel is like the unclothed body and glaze its clothing. Generally, Japanese Buddhist figurative art is not ceramic. It's wood, lacquer, or bronze, and ceramic figures in Japan are generally relegated to small-scale dolls, unless, of course, we're talking about prehistoric Buddhist figures. There's no history of large-scale ceramic figurative work in Japan, as in, for example, China or Italy. Next. Kondo's silver mist brings to mind, for me also, Chinese-Australian artist Lindy Lee's painting, The Tenderness of Rain, made during a residency she did in Scotland. Kondo claims inspiration also from his time in the rainy country. Both artists riff on fire and water, Lee burning small holes onto paper to suggest a cascade of rain or dewdrops, and both reference Buddhism. I started with a reference to the Zen master Dogen, and let me conclude with him as well. Lee's recent survey exhibition was titled Moon in a Dewdrop, the title of a collection of poems by Dogen. Dogen references continued well after his lifetime. In the early 19th century, the haiku master and Buddhist lay priest Kobayashi Issa chose dewdrops also as a favorite subject. After the death of his daughter, Issa wrote a very famous poem. Let me quote it. "This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet," suggesting that although we mustn't cling to a world as fleeting as a dewdrop, we can't help but also be attached to it. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Meghen. Thank you so much for those many insights. And although Meghen was drawing some great parallels there to contemporary practice, she was also very much focusing on Kondo's connections to the past, both in terms of his own family tradition and also the deeper still history of Japanese and world ceramics. My brief for this evening is to cover as completely as I can in a very short time Kondo's many connections to contemporary art. If you'll take me to the next slide, please, Mark. Beginning with this tea bowl, the wave tea bowl, in the Ginteki glaze, the silver mist glaze that Meghen's already spoken about, and with this marbled clay, which you've also seen in her slides. And I want to propose a slightly different vantage point on this object and indeed on Kondo's work in general, which is that we can understand it as simultaneously being a very intense material practice, so obviously demonstrative of an amazing level of skill and knowledge of ceramic as a medium and as a historical tradition, as Meghen's beautifully illustrated, but also as, I think, a response to contemporary life, to the contemporary condition of existence, which is turbulent, which is technological, and which has been, in fact, called postmodern. So words like the simulacrum or the idea of the spectacular might be attached to an object like this one, just as much as it's rooted in the past. Therefore, it also has an eye towards the uncertain future. And what I'm thinking of particularly here is the sense that this object, of course, is not digital in its creation, but it has a kind of magic, a kind of dematerialization, and ultimately a kind of volatility that we might associate with the experience of the sliding, frictionless, depthless world of the internet and digital experience generally. And I think it's fascinating to reflect, if you'll permit a pun, on an object like this one as simultaneously exemplifying materiality at its utmost, also real world incidents like the tsunami of 2011 that Meghen also referred to, which was a proximate inspiration or influence on Kondo when he developed this language, but also on a much harder to pin down sense of ourselves as hurtling through space and time in a way that we can't quite understand. So if you go to the next slide, what I would like to suggest is that this places Kondo in a tradition of another kind, a tradition of contemporary art practice, which goes back particularly, I think, to the 1960s and the advent of pop art and to figures like Andy Warhol. And I'm showing you one of his later works here just because it's an obvious comparison with Kondo's silver mist glaze. This is his series Diamond Dust Shoes, which was made, when he was at the height of his commercial powers, if you like, although not necessarily at the height of his critical reception. And as you will know, if you've seen these works in person, they're covered with this very fine pulverized diamond dust that shines, gleams in the light, and announces the status of the painting itself as a kind of hyper commodity. If you go to the next slide, you can see an even more overt and aggressive extension of this idea. This famous, indeed infamous sculpture for the love of God, which is a skull paved with 8,601 diamonds of various sizes, which was sold for, depending on who you believe, something like $50 million, although it later proved that Hearst and his dealer, Jay Joplin with White Cube, were majority interest holders in the object even after they sold it. So it was something more like an initial public offering of a company than it was like a conventional sale of an artwork, and thereby extremely self-referential, again, at a kind of absurdly elevated level of its own status as a commodity. It also is worth pointing out that the title, For the Love of God, was simultaneously a satirical allusion to the object as a kind of self-portrait, a grandiose self-portrait. Might be worth saying that Hearst was also inspired by a turquoise paved Mesoamerican deity sculpture, which certainly was in his mind when thinking about this sort of self-portrait poking fun at himself for his temerity and having made it, but also something that his mother had said to him, which was, Damien, for the love of God, what will you come up with next? Which is where the title came from. So if you go to the next slide, certainly when we look at this self-portrait by Takahiro Kondo, we do not see that kind of mockery or humor. Indeed, we see an image of tremendous solemnity and seriousness, There is that reference to the Zazen pose, of course. There's also, I think, deepening that reference, the title reduction points us to the fact that the sculpture would have actually shrunk in size when it was fired as the water evaporated. So there's also perhaps an allusion to the idea of a kind of austere meditative practice by which the body itself withers away and the soul thereby grows or has a kind of efflorescence in corresponding motion. So certainly a very intense object and very much aligned to religiosity and spiritualism, but also because of its surface and because of this swirling materiality of which it's made, we can think of it as a portrait of a contemporary person, a person who is caught in the wave, who is caught in the currents of change. Go on to the next slide. We can then think about how that gesture relates to a different history, not so much connected to pop art as the idea of self-portraiture in the technological age itself. And here is an irresistible point of comparison, Namjoon Paik's hilarious TV Buddha, which is a closed circuit representation of this statue contemplating itself. So you might say a kind of postmodern version of the divine. Go on to the next slide. We can see some other more recent expressions of this same kind of destabilization as it applies to the self-portrait genre. So here is Jeanine Antoni's famous sculpture Lick and Lather. These are just two objects from a series, which are made in chocolate on the left and soap on the right. And as you may know, what Antoni did was to cast herself in these materials, and then she tried to eat her own visage in chocolate, and then she took the soap version of herself into the bath and bathed herself with it, and the hot water, of course, ate away at the surface and made it kind of erode as if it were an ancient sculpture. So two different kinds of reduction, again, of the surface of these objects. But here there's a kind of allusion, very direct allusion, in fact, to the culture of femininity, the culture to which women are subjected in our society, ideas about desire, ideas about self-love and self-perfection that she seems to be working through in some way in these objects. And one thing that struck me when I was writing the essay about Kondo's work for the book that Meghen mentioned, that's occasioned by the show, is that you might not initially think of Kondo's work as being about masculinity, but once you compare it to Antoni's work, you realize that of course it is. It's an image not just of an artist, but of a male artist. Indeed, the unclothed body of a male artist, just as Antoni is showing herself as a kind of academic nude bust here. Next slide, please. When thinking about this idea of masculinity, I was then prompted to consider the relationship between Kondo's work and that of Mark Quinn, particularly this series of works that he made called Self, simply Self as the title, each of which is made of 10 pints of the artist's own blood, which is taken out of his veins over a course of weeks and months, and then cast cold into this hypernaturalistic representation, almost like a death mask, in fact, and then kept permanently refrigerated as if it were in a kind of medical unit, so that it will not turn back into fluid. And here again, I was thinking about not just an idea of masculinity, you know, the idea of the kind of vigorous male with blood pumping through his veins that Quinn seems to be referring to here, but also the disparity between Quinn's Christian iconography, blood, of course, being absolutely central to the Passion of Christ, that story, and to much else besides in Christian theology, and Kondo's reference to Buddhism. So a very close relationship here, I think, not initially apparent, but once you start to think about the different frameworks of reference, actually a really strong mirroring between what Quinn is doing and what Kondo is doing. Next slide. If we were to go a little bit further into a kind of abstract form of self-portraiture, but closer to the medium of clay, we might think of Urs Fischer's series of very large-scale aluminum sculptures, which are in fact called Big Clay, which are made in a very intriguing way, which is as follows. He takes bits of clay and crushes them in his hand, just closes his fist around them. thereby imprinting his fingerprints into the wet surface, then scans those pieces of clay, sends them to a fabricator in Switzerland who make them at this enormous scale in foam, just enlarging the digital scan. Then those pieces of foam are sent to China, where they're physically rendered in aluminum, welded together perfectly seamlessly, finished, and then shipped to wherever they're going to be shown. So this, you might say, is a kind of self-portrait gesture of the artist as an originator of grandiose gestures, very much like Hearst, in fact, in a way. And again, operating at an absurdly high level of production value. But here with an additional level of self-mockery, which is that Fischer has done almost nothing at all. All he's done is squeezed his hand around a little bit of plasticine clay. And this abstract sculpture, which might remind us perhaps of a late Willem de Kooning bronze or some other form of abstract sculpture, perhaps a John Chamberlain, is the result. If you go to the next slide, which is my last, just to show this white porcelain vessel again that Meghen also showed, you know, again, it's not the most obvious comparison, but once you start to think about it, you see the same play between abstraction and figuration. In fact, you could say that this disrupted vase almost looks like a Tang Dynasty dancing figure with the waving sleeves. And there is a kind of choreography to this object that somewhat resembles the Urs Fischer. And although, again, the element of satire is entirely absent, as was the case in my comparison between Kondo's Ginteki glaze and what Andy Warhol or Damien Hirst was doing with their own different kind of spectacular surfaces, I think that we can see an extent to which this object, just like the Fischer, again, reflects this turbulence and transformative energy that circulates around the art object. So in the case of Fischer, the gesture actually passes through the medium of the digital. It is, after all, initially a scan, and it's sent from one place to another, and indeed rendered using digital tools. Again, Kondo is using entirely analog craft-based techniques, and yet I think the contemporaneity of the object, though it may be much simpler and in some ways much more modest than what Fischer has done, is equally intense, equally present. And to me, this seems like as 21st century a ceramic object that as one could wish for, reflecting on its past, but also thinking about the uncertain condition of the object in the present and into the future. So that's what I'll say to start us off. And I guess we'll now have some questions from James. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask some initial questions and just try to get the ball rolling for other people's questions afterwards. Meghen, you mentioned in your presentation the lineal succession as regards to the Kondo family. Given your knowledge of Tamimoto Kinkichi and that he was the mentor to two of the older Kondo clan, I was wondering how you believe this may have influenced this succession. Did Tamimoto's practice that encompassed broader influences outside Japanese tradition set the model for the elder Kondo and therefore have a generational effect?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mentioned Tamimoto a few times in my brief set of slides there. It's not hyperbole to say that no individual in 20th century Japan had as much impact over the course of ceramics discourse in Japan, most likely, in my opinion, than Tamimoto, who came to the medium of ceramics with the eye of the modern artist who had spent time in London and Paris and traveled throughout different parts of the world. Essentially, and this has been written about by others in relation to the Kondo family, and I want to acknowledge the important sources that exist on this topic now in English, which is great. Tamimoto really focused on the importance of originality. And we take this for granted today. We're well past the modernist moment, in some senses, but this was quite extraordinary, quite revolutionary, quite radical when Tomimoto set off to, on one hand, retain historical methods of production, the use of materials, particularly overglaze enamel, but doing so using completely original designs. So in the fern box that the fern covered jar that I showed you, there's no Buddhist meaning of ferns that I know of. Ferns were something new to overglaze enamel in Japan, and to my knowledge, Japanese design in general. It was in England that I think he picked up on ferns as a decorative motif idea. He had gone daily to the Victoria and Albert Museum and was steeped in the designs and ethos in the arts and crafts movement in England. In any case, he's drawing ferns in his own garden and using those as the basis for that covered jar design. And so that very simple in one way idea, be original, I think gets embraced by the Kondo family of ceramic artists, and it is the through line in all of their work. And although there are some similarities that we can identify in the work generationally, when we see, for example, the Sometsuke blue on porcelain work side by side, when you read what Kondo Takahiro has said, another great resource, by the way, is the recently published book, Listening to Clay, in which Kondo Takahiro is interviewed, and it's all been translated in English. That's a book written by Louise Court and Alison Halsey North. In that interview, he has said that one of the disappointments that his father had was that his work, I don't want to misquote it here, but basically there's a sentiment over time generationally of trying to do things new, not to keep the family traditional style intact. And we really see that carried forth to such a dynamic degree, I think, in the work of Kondo Takahiro, as we see in this image. So great question. Thank you.
One more question for you. Do you think that Takahiro is an adherent of Tomimoto's belief that form is of overriding importance?
Yes, and he said that. He has said that. And there's another great essay recently published in English. This is really a boon time to be reading about Takahiro Kondo in English. There, I use the English order of his name. There's an essay he wrote in a recently published book by Joan Mervis on Tomimoto Kenkichi and his sphere of influence. Yeah, I urge everyone to refer to those sources. Did that answer your question?
I think so, yes. I'm interested in understanding the relationship of Takahiro's silver mist glaze to form. Glenn, you quote him as saying, "It's largely thanks to silver mist that starting over in the year 2000, I could extend my practice to include pieces that were more sculptural in character," unquote, in your essay.
Yeah, which is a slightly perplexing thing to say when you stop to think about it, because why would it be that changing the surface of the object would enable you to transform your entire practice into a more sculptural direction? And the way that I took that statement, and by the way, I should just parenthetically say that, of course, Takahiro Kondo sensei is on the call. So I hope he's following everything that we're saying and reflecting on it positively. But we'll do our best to speak for him. But the way that I take that statement is as a signification of the conceptual importance of Ginteke as opposed to its stylistic importance. So of course it is amazing looking, and it renders each of his objects lustrous and imbues it with a kind of beguiling aesthetic quality that is unique. Yet at the same time, I think it also transports them into a different dimension in a more than visual way. It also creates a sense of what I would describe as a kind of mediation between the object and the viewer, and announces the act of looking as such as being a topic of the work. So if you like, it thematizes the act of looking at the thing while you're looking at it. And of course it is mirrored. So it actually, not in the way that a normal flat mirror would, but it also suggests a kind of reflection on yourself as a viewer. And so this is how I understood that statement, that the opening up of his practice through Ginteke was fundamentally conceptual in nature, not just visual.
Okay, well, in discussing the foundational role of the silver mist glaze in Takahiro's work, you said, quote, "These are ceramics that anticipate their own mediation, artworks that, even when encountered in person, feel as though they're witnessed from a vast distance, inhabiting a dimension unto themselves."
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and that builds very much on what I just said. And here we get into a slightly subjective terrain, because I think, like all great artists, there's a very profound emotional effect in Kondo's work, which may well vary for different people. In my essay, I said that I found his work simultaneously stirring and saddening. I'm not sure if most people would agree with that, but I'm thinking particularly here of the Reduction series and his self-portraits in general, that there's a sense of, again, amazement and depth, and they're stunning things to behold, especially in person, but even in images. But at the same time, the fact that he's using a life casting process means that he has to close his eyes. And there's a sense of watching somebody who's not watching you back, and a sense of incredible vulnerability, the nakedness of the body, the smallness of the size, and also something of a deathly character, perhaps, but not death in the sense of loss, maybe death in the sense of a kind of transcendence of the body into a domain of pure soul, which is very poignant and very moving, I think, to be in the presence of a physical object that does that much immaterial work, I think is, it's not something you run into every day, and even in the world of art. And so I think that alienness or distance that I was trying to describe there really has to do with a meditation on the difficult nature of reality itself, its incommensurability, our inability to fundamentally satisfy our instincts towards the transcendent with our everyday reality. And I feel like his work lives in that gap, that space of wondering and questioning, which makes it radically open-ended.
Okay, I also have another question for you. You state in your essay, quote, "He typically displays a more constructive approach, creating rigorous compositional frameworks in which to explore material behavior," unquote, referring to Takahiro. To quote you again, quote, "His acceptance of apparently catastrophic failure," unquote, but are these simply failures, or are they like happy accidents, as makers sometimes reference when unexpected results comes from out of a firing and that result is stunning? Are you suggesting that he is setting up experiments to gauge how the material will react, and then using those experiments to purposefully manipulate as a result, such as the large white vessel pictured on the cover of the catalog?
Right, which we're looking at here again. Yeah, we had the right picture in front of us, at least, if nothing else. I mean, it's a great question, James. I think what I would want to do here is distinguish between the happy accidents that we normally associate with ceramic practice and what Takahiro Kondo is doing. So, the idea that pottery is an ongoing experiment, that you don't really know what the kiln is going to do, how glazes are going to interact with one another, all the adventitious and opportunistic aspects of the discipline. We're used to that. And that is nothing unique to Kondo's practice. I think what's less usual is this framing of actual failure as being a generative process. And there are very few ceramic artists that do this. I mean, I can think of a couple, Stephen Young Lee, Korean American artist here in the States, Takahiro Kondo has, in Japan, the colleague Takeru Kawata, who I think it deserves to be mentioned here, who some people may know the work, kind of a post-apocalyptic, post-pop ceramic idiom with great fissures and cracks and sort of mudslides or landslides in the shapes. And so he does have some peers in this respect, but I think it is very unusual. It's not the usual or the more familiar happy accidents of ceramic. It's a much more existential maneuver that he's making, where it really does seem as if the object has left his control entirely and has reached a state of disaster. And as we've said a couple of times already, he's been very deeply influenced by the tsunami of 2011 and other natural disasters. And he's, I think, also reflecting on the enormity of what it is to live on the earth and then to make something of earth. So he's trying to capture all of that force in the work as well.
Okay, so these are true failures then that occur.
Well, I think they are about the existence of true failure.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's an inversion there. It's sort of like, when I say that Warhol or Hearst are interested in making works that announce their status as commodities, that is hardly to say that their work then sinks into the status of only being a commodity. Instead, it sort of, in their case, kind of tap dances and merry-go-round, circulating that whole issue. And I think I would say something similar for Kondo, that he's thinking about what it is to contemplate failure and using that, as I said, as a generative energy in the work, which sounds contradictory and complex, because it is contradictory and complex, which is what is postmodern about it.
Okay, well, I think I've used up my 10 minutes of questions. If we wanted to open it up to other viewers.
Yeah, so if anyone in our participants had questions, if you feel free to type them into the chat, I can share them with James, Meghen, and Glenn. Just waiting a moment or two, not seeing any questions just yet. We have about 10 minutes left in our program. I guess I'd throw out a question. This is for James, Meghen, or Glenn. For me, I'm thinking about a little bit, sort of in the broad sense of ceramic or clay as a material, as a medium, and sort of how it gets weighted down as craft and not thought as much as fine art or conceptual. And thinking about today's contemporary art scene, I'm just wondering if any of you had comments about what you think sort of either opportunities or challenges that artists working within ceramics have in this kind of age that we're in right now, working with this medium.
Well, I would say that that's shifted a lot in the past 10 years. Certainly at the beginning of my career, I felt like I had to fight my corner as somebody who was interested both in contemporary art and in ceramics, and insisting that there was at least a Venn diagram of overlap there. I think now, boy, you'd almost be hard pressed to find a New York gallery that doesn't have a ceramist on their roster, and you certainly it would be impossible to go to a mainstream art fair like Frieze or TIFAF and not find contemporary art made in clay. I happened to be beaming in from Longhouse today, which is Jack Larson's estate in East Hampton, and we're just here to install a show that's opening next week of contemporary art in this amazing space, and much of it is made of clay. So it's become, I think, abundantly evident to most of the art world that clay does lots of things that other mediums don't, which is exciting, and also that it does excitingly connect mediums that people are more familiar with, especially paint. And so there's an idea that in clay you could have this kind of three-dimensional version of expressionism as you would find in painting, which I think has been an extremely decisive shift in the fortunes of the medium recently. I don't know if Meghen would see that same kind of shift in the Japanese context, but that's certainly my perspective on it from an American point of view.
In a nutshell, as I mentioned earlier, in Japan historically, there was never a hierarchy placing ceramics and other so-called decorative arts below in status painting or sculpture, as in Europe. Tomimoto's cover jars in the 1950s were highly valued. They sold for as much as the price of a house. So that sort of differential, just that dialectic, never emerged in Japan until the late 19th century, when Japan entered the world stage to show craft objects at international expositions. And that's when, for the first time, the word for art actually had to be created. And yeah, so there isn't that that history in Japan. Since the 1960s, there's been an influence on a number of Japanese ceramic artists from ceramic art in the United States, and that's an interesting history to trace. But as we see in the work of the Kondo generations of ceramic artists, there's just such a complex, deep discourse of ceramics as an important form of creative expression in Japan. I wanted to mention one quick thing in response to the discussion a moment ago about the question of the happy accident when it comes to the large undecorated porcelain piece by Kondo Takahiro. You know, we can frame all of these Kondo ceramics in so many different sort of contexts. So it's fascinating to hear Glenn's take on how this work relates to pop art and beyond. The notion of a broken pot, I think, is in some sense a riff on this very famous early 17th century pot called the Yabure Bukuro. It's hard to say. The burst bag, mizusashi or water jar that was made at the Iga kilns, and that literally collapsed over the course of its firing and was later repaired with lacquer. Is it exactly like what Kondo is doing with his work? No, he didn't repair it. He's leaving the break, which is much larger, exposed. It's rendered, useless as a vessel. It's calling our attention to the void inside it. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there.
That's an excellent point, Meghen. And of course, there's also another context you could put it in, which is simply the archaeological experience of ceramics as broken things.
Right.
And even I suppose this may be a little less relevant, but the beginning ceramists' instruction to cut the pot with a wire so they can see how they're doing with throwing an even wall. So this idea of a pot that's opened up like a peach, that's split, I think is in fact very multivalent, that reference. So it's not, that's a great point. It's not only failure, there's lots of other things happening.
Yeah. When you made it,
well, I was just going to ask you a different question, Meghen, if I might, which
Sure.
is, I was wondering what you thought about the relationship between Kondo himself and his family and other avant-garde, like self-declared Japanese avant-garde movements in ceramics. And I'm aware we also have Joan Mervis on the call, who's done so much work on Yagi Kazo and the Sodesha group, which is the famous mid-century avant-garde in ceramics. And as you say, there's also this influence from the United States, coming from people like Peter Volkas, who were active in Japan, Shiko Takezu. And I guess I wonder what your perception is about Kondo's position in this kind of paradoxical tradition of avant-gardism that goes back at least that far and perhaps further in Kyoto and elsewhere in Japan.
Yeah, as I mentioned briefly, I think it's an extension of what starts in Kyoto with Sodesha in the 1950s. We can really see it as one continuum. And it's no accident that it all takes place in Kyoto, I think, given the number of highly skilled ceramists over time in the city who had to make work to a very high caliber, given the the connoisseurs and collectors in the city historically and in the 20th century. There was a lot to rebel against when it came to kyoyaki or Kyoto ceramics. So there's a fascinating tension then in the 1950s when this notion of the objet or sculptural vessel erupts. And at the same time, I wouldn't want to place Kondo Takahiro's entire work into the box of simply Kyoto avant-garde ceramics, as you've pointed out, Glenn. It certainly belongs to an international context of art. So yeah, I wanted to also mention one thing you said earlier. You made a gesture like this, and it reminded me again not to focus too much on that last white vessel, but getting back to Tomimoto, it all seems to go back to Tomimoto. Tomimoto had this saying that in throwing on the wheel, there's a natural gesture that occurs according to gravity, and that as a form opens up, it's like a flower. And I think we can see that piece again as responding to that sort of natural centrifugal force that occurs on the potter's wheel, and that's something that Tomimoto was really attentive to in his teachings to his students. And something else you mentioned, I just can't help but think about too, is this notion of the self-portrait. We think of a self-portrait as something quite new, perhaps in a Japanese context, but there's a tradition of Zen masters like Hakuin doing painted self-portraits, albeit not very frequently, and not to my knowledge ever in sculpture. But anyway, that does exist.
There are those lacquered sculptures of Zen priests and monks that are made in a memorial capacity.
The portraits, yes.
Yeah, they're not self-portraits.
Self-portraits.
Yeah, that seems like an important precedent though as well. Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, we have, and I think both Meghen and I were trying to get this across in our talks, and maybe this is true of every great artist, but certainly an artist who's working in clay in Japan, one might expect this, that it's the vertex between the past and the possibilities of a future that is as yet undefined that makes the work exciting. And so many of these things that we're kind of circling back to have that one theme in common. Very, very interesting.
Indeed, indeed.
Great. Well, we are unfortunately at time, but I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And of course, thank you, James, Meghen, and Glenn, all for your insights, intelligence, and passion. I'd like to also thank Kondo Takahiro for his brilliant work, and also Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz for access to their collections for this amazing exhibition, and also this incredible catalog that resulted from it. And so again, thank you all. Really appreciate you joining.